Hello again from the west of Ireland, and I've got a great battle to show you between the number 1 and number 2 players in the world. Magnus Carlsen against Fabiano Caruana, playing in round 4 of Norway chess. So Carlsen with the white pieces, and he's playing a pretty orthodox opening here with white. You'll notice when he plays against the stronger players, then he sticks to kind of classical opening strategy and very solid stuff. And it's a Nimzo Indian from Caruana against players like, Ariantari with the black pieces. He was prepared to gamble, but here Carlsen plays Queen C2, very respectable. No A3, or he's played E3 as well here, but Queen C2, very respectable variation. And what's interesting is that Caruana also shows a lot of respect here and doesn't play one of the sharper lines against the Queen C2 variation, but also plays something pretty solid. And I think this would have suited Carlsen very well, actually. In this line, very well-known line indeed, it's hard for black to generate serious winning chances. Really, we quickly arrive at a position where you could say only two results are possible. It's either going to be a win for white or a draw. So this endgame has been reached in many, many games. And I think it's pretty clear that white has a slight advantage. You can see that it's all to do with pawn structure. White has this very nice structure here, controls more of the center. Black's kingside pawns have been damaged, and something needs to be done about that backward c-pawn, which Caruana does straight away with knight a5. Time to develop, knight f3. Now we've seen here Rajabov played rook c8 here and c5. That certainly doesn't guarantee a draw. Caruana decided to bring that knight back into play straight away. And then he broke immediately with c5. So Carlsen connects his rooks. We always like to see that. And rook c8. Although black has managed to get in c5, it's still clear that white is slightly better here. The king is in a nice position in the middle, and even if black takes here on d4, then the knight is going to reach a good spot on d4. And really if black's king were already on e7, covering those entry points on the d file, you'd say, okay, that should be pretty good, but it takes time to get there. In any case, it's white's move, Carlsen to move, and he exchanged on c5. So these pawns are now split. It's an isolated pawn, but of course black has the chance to attack down the b file. Rook c2, logical, and now white can bring the rook over to one of these squares. King f8, so the king hurries into the middle. But, really, as I said, only two results are possible from this position with normal play, let's say. Knight c2, knight d2, the knight swings round to a better square. It wasn't going anywhere from f3. And c4, so this is about just kind of nailing that pawn to b2 so that black gets counterplay. So this is the game continuation. Now after rook b8, it means that if white takes the pawn on c4, then after all those exchanges, then of course black will be able to take the pawn on b2 with check. And so that's why Carlsen nudges the king up to f3. So now you could say he's kind of threatening to take that. So for example, let's make a waiting move for black. If f5, then we can take on c4. And then, after these exchanges, white's rook will come in, collect the A pawn. Now, that certainly doesn't guarantee a win, but only white can win that position. So let's go back. So Caruana basically has a difficult choice here. He has to decide which kind of worse ending do I head for. What's the best way to try and get a draw out of this position? And it's not easy to evaluate or to weigh up all these different options, particularly when none of them look particularly promising. He played c3. That's interesting. So he gives up that, well, weak pawn, that weak c pawn. And it means that he leaves Carlsen now with split pawns. So Carlsen a pawn up, very nice. But they're not it's not the most beautiful extra pawn in the world, particularly when there are two of those pawns on the queen side. Now it's interesting here. Caruana, after a big think, played rook c5. He spent 18 minutes over that move, and as I said, he's weighing up his options, trying to find the least worst ending. He could have played knight c4. I feel that's kind of the principled move in this position, to exchange off the knight to reach a rook and pawn endgame, still a pawn down, but, well, you could say traditionally rook and pawn endgames offer the best drawing chances, particularly with these split pawns. It's a really tough decision. After rook d1, then white's rook threatens to come to d7 to attack a7 and potentially f7 if the other rook can come in, but also to come to d4 as well, to try and drive that rook away. So this certainly would not be easy for black, but you feel this might be his best option. You know, black can play rook b7 here and always retreat that rook to c5 if it's attacked. I think that's kind of the principled way to go, but it's not easy. Oh, we've got alarms going off here. It's all going on. But rook c5 played, and I kind of understand, you know, why he was reluctant to do that, because white would have some activity. But now the c pawn advances, and it's just that little step forward for white. Whoops, sorry, let me go back. I leapt ahead there. So c4 played. This is the game continuation. f5, that seems nice, to advance the f pawn and control some squares here. And the king comes round to d3. So that means that as the king lends more support to the c pawn, it might mean that white can at some point offer an exchange of rooks on the b file. King d7 and rook c3, yeah, so again gives perhaps an option to play rook b3 or knight b3. And here it's probably best for black just to wait for the moment. But Caruana preempted knight b3. He played rook c6, and this was certainly a mistake. And things are now slipping because the c pawn advanced. It's not clear to me what Caruana missed. He must have just underestimated this move. And now Carlsen really takes control of the position. So that knight potentially coming into one of these very nice squares. Rook a6. Knight e5 check, king e7, and the king just steps out of any danger, coming back to e2. Carlsen's kingside pawns, of course, absolutely solid. They give the king protection. He hasn't made any unnecessary pawn moves, and that makes a massive difference to the position. When you start to make progress elsewhere, means the king always has a safe spot to come back to. Rook up to c2, just gently, just covering the second rank. Knight d5, rook d3, rook c8, and now rook b3 taking control of the b file, and really this is extremely difficult to defend. Rook c4, another really nice creeping move from Carlsen, taking control of squares on the fourth rank. It might mean, for example, at some moment that he can advance the a pawn, and that at some moment will give the rook more freedom to perhaps move down to b8. Could be that it can swing round to attack that pawn. So it just gives white more options. A really nice move, rook c4. Rook a5, attacking the c-pawn, knight d3. So yeah, a4 I think is again the move that could be very useful, followed maybe by rook b5. And Caruana, well, running short of time, he lashed out with e5, but actually, well, this isn't very complicated. Carlsen simply took that. And that means that you can see these pawns are just shot through. Rook takes c5, rook c5, rook c5, and rook b7 check, of course. If the rook interposes here, well, let's just, whoops, let's go back. That was unintended. Yeah, if rook c7, then rook takes here, and knight c6 check picks up that a pawn. So rook b7 check played, king e6, knight takes f7, and white is now 2 pawns up, and there's more to come basically, because all these pawns are weak. As I mentioned before, very important that white has maintained that beautiful clean pawn structure on the king side. And this is just mopping up now. It looks as though that knight is really wayward at the edge of the board. In fact, it can come back into play very easily, certainly can't be trapped. Knight f7 check, king c5, and now knight e5. 2 clear pawns, and now it's just a case of playing very solidly, making sure everything is protected. Knight d3 check, king c4, king c2. That king is going to be driven away very quickly. Knight f4, and that was the final move of the game. Here, Caruana resigned. Understandable, the knight has reached the dream square. If that's taken, then rook b4 check, and rook takes f4, and you can see one of those pawns is going to drop. Well, it's interesting to see how Carlsen changed his style today when he's facing the number 2 player in the world, Fabiano Caruana, who he has, of course, great respect for. And that was the first win that Carlsen has had over Caruana in, I think this was the 20th game. They'd had 19 draws before then. As Carlsen said, this is probably the best position he'd had against Caruana since game 1 of the World Championship match in London. That's pretty extraordinary, but yeah, a good feeling for Carlsen to win this game. And after 4 rounds, he takes the lead in Norway chess. There's a free day, and then they resume play on Saturday. Thanks for watching.